So hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this webinar, all about effective deployment of teaching assistants. My name is Tom Colquhoun. I'm Director of Somerset Research School, which is based at the Blue School in Wells in Somerset, where I'm also Assistant Head Teacher. I've been teaching, I think, 20, possibly 25, 26 years now. Held various roles in senior leadership for the last 13, 14 years. Great to be with you. I've got a couple of co-presenters. So Claire, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Hi everyone, my name is Clare Anderson. I am currently the Head of Service for Education Partnerships for Bristol City Council. So my portfolio, I have school improvement for our maintained schools, early years, governor support, and I also have a new inclusive learning service which was launched in September that supports schools, mainstream settings across the city around their ordinary available provision. I've been in that role just over a year. Prior to that, I was an exec head teacher. I've had schools just outside of Bath, in Somerset, and then one in North Somerset just before I finished. And apart from that last one, all my schools have been serving areas where there is high levels of poverty and high numbers of children eligible for free school meals. So yeah, year six teacher by trade, and then fell into headship and stayed there for about 10 or 12 years. So yeah, nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Claire. What about you, Sally?
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Sally Franklin. I'm an education researcher until relatively recently based at University College London, lecturing across all aspects of SEND. Predominantly, previous to that, I was a teacher and a SENCO for a long time. In the last 7 or 8 years or so, I've been heavily involved in research around TA deployment, and so I now work as part of the Maximising the Impact of TA team, looking at TA deployment and practice both here in the UK and internationally, and that's most of what I do nowadays. So I'm here under that capacity. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you both. So busy people, but really knowledgeable, experienced people. Sally's too modest to say that she's the first name listed on the advisory panel of the updated EEF guidance. So when we go through it today, she really knows what's in it and why it's in there. So we'll get cracking then through the session this afternoon. I won't ask you all to introduce yourself, but if you fancy it, you can update your name, your Zoom name in your little thumbnail there to include your school or your setting, if that makes sense and that helps other people, just so you know, feel a little bit more connected. Up to you, no pressure. Right, so here we are, Wednesday, 3rd of June. This afternoon and what you can expect. We're going to start with sort of the context, the big issues, the big picture. Firstly, around evidence-informed practice most generally, and then more specifically looking at SEND, looking at disadvantage, and some of that context there. Sally will talk us through the evidence base, what's out there, what we already know, what's been done, what's been trialed and evaluated and reported upon. We'll then take time to go through the guidance report itself from the EEF, and all of the recommendations within it, and each of those will include a sort of a key takeaway message. We know this afternoon isn't really a training session. This is an eye-opener, an awareness raiser. This is bringing you to the documents, to the guidance out there and the supporting resources. There is an offer of further training and support at the end if you or your schools or your trust are interested to take this further. So that's what I hope you're happy with and is to be expected for this rest of this afternoon's session. So first of all, a reminder probably, hopefully for most of you, that our research school, Somerset Research School, based in Somerset, clearly is working with and for and on behalf of the Education Endowment Foundation, or the EEF as more commonly known. They are a fantastic organisation based up in London, but have this national network of research schools, which I'll come to in a moment. The sort of three-pronged approach really of the EEF is as follows. The first effort, if you like, is that the EEF are trying to make more good quality evidence available to the English system by generating, giving opportunities for schools, recruiting, funding schools to be involved in decent education research in the English school system. 10 years ago plus, I guess, you might have read something in the TES or seen something online, dig a little deeper and you see that it's, beneath the headline, we're talking about 12 psychology undergraduates from UCLA. And you think, well, how is that relevant to me and my grumpy year fours on a wet Thursday afternoon in Somerset somewhere? So that generation effort has meant an awful lot of funding has been dished out. An awful lot of organisations have gone into schools, testing out and trialling approaches and reporting back so that we can all learn from that. But of course, once the evidence has been generated by education research, it's no good to anyone really, not anyone, but certainly to busy school teachers and school leaders, unless some degree of synthesis takes place. So summaries, reviews, toolkits and so on are produced by the good people at the EEF to try and make that research evidence more accessible, easier to engage with and to act upon. So they're doing some of the heavy lifting for us and giving us the good stuff, I suppose, to make our decisions in our schools. But even once evidence has been generated, it's been synthesized, unless then there's an evidence mobilization effort, and we get the good stuff to the chalk face, to schools, to teachers and school leaders, then it's no good to anybody. So that's where things like the EEF's guidance reports come in, and their recommendations. They're getting off the fence at this point and saying, look, if you can, try and do these things in your school settings. And that map on the right-hand side there, just indicating that the research school network, the national network, is part of that evidence mobilisation effort. There are 33 research schools across the country, and I know we've got people on the call from all sorts of different places. You can find those by just searching Research School Network and looking at the map. But in the southwest, where we're based this afternoon, there are 5. One down in Cornwall, one in Devon, one in Hampshire, one in Gloucestershire, and us in Somerset. So, your connection to this wider national network can be found pretty easily, we hope. So that's the EEF's mission, if you like. And I think what it doesn't say on the slide, but what's really important to remember is that right at the heart of their mission is A, to try and support the system to be more evidence informed in their approaches, clearly, with what you've just seen there. But B, it's also about that supporting and helping all children to thrive and to improve, but particularly focusing on challenging the really stubborn disadvantage gaps that exist in this country and, in fact, across the world. So hopefully that sets the scene a little bit about the EEF, about the Research School Network. We're now going to consider the big picture, if you like, in terms of specifically what we're talking about this afternoon, the TA workforce and this deployment of TA principle. So Claire, over to you just to talk this one through.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So just going to have a little bit of a dig into the numbers, thinking about TAs as a workforce in their own right and then in comparison with our teachers. So you can see from the stats on the screen there that we're looking at 410,000 teaching assistants, and then that only equates to 288,812 full-time equivalents. So you'll probably know from your settings that TAs are often part-time staff. They may hold dual roles or triple roles in your schools. I know from my experience, I had a lot that were teaching assistants, might be midday supervisors, breakfast club, after school club, that type of thing. But actually there are more TAs than teachers in the workforce at primary, but it's that total of around 5 billion in funding. So when you think about that in comparison to some other areas of spend, it's more than roads and social housing. I think that's always one that really sits with me when you think about value for money and kind of percentage allocation. It's a huge chunk of that workforce, yet as Tom will reference a bit later on, when thinking about the impact of those, there really is this just thinking about the gravity, the size of that workforce and the challenges that then come with that. They are also the biggest allocation of your pupil premium spend. If you think about your pupil premium strategy, the ideal would be that for targeted intervention, which is where you would probably be using most of your teaching assistants, that should be around 25% of that PP budget, and 50% on high quality teaching. But in practice, that really isn't the case, and it will further increase where you're using teaching assistants maybe for wider strategies as well. And then just thinking about how that translates into barriers, challenges for school leadership. Having lots of part-time staff, it means it's a real challenge to have that collective time together for training, for supervision, effective line management, preparation, planning. And I don't know about colleagues around the screen, what their experience is. Often for me at primary, lots of the TA workforce come from the local community, and if you're serving an area of disadvantage, you know, an area of deprivation, often the barriers and challenges that your families and children will face are also reflected in your workforce. And so again, there's an impact there around, you know, thinking about support for the workforce, but also that tension between making sure that is a workforce we are reflective of the community that we serve. So yeah, just kind of holding a bit of a spotlight on some of those numbers and thinking about, yeah, the capacity that there is, that we want to maximise, really.
Thank you, Claire. So clearly we've seen and heard, you know, this is a very significant proportion of the workforce, very significant spend. So we're now just going to have a look at the context of where the teaching assistant or LSA or whatever, however you refer to them in your setting, where that context is, if you like. And I guess before I show you any of the graphics and the figures here, the first caveat to add, I suppose, is that we know that there isn't a TA, an LSA across the land who isn't starting from a point of kindness. There is no TA that wakes up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to go to school and be as ineffective as I can be, or I'm going to ruin a child's education. Of course, that is not the case. We know actually that the immense value that this part of the support staff and networks in our schools plays. They are hugely valuable, particularly when I look back to global pandemic and enforced school closures. The work that kind of stuck the bricks together in schools was absolutely fantastic. But looking back to when the EF's flagship resource, the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, was first published, Durham University and the EF combined, when they considered the first kind of 40 strands on the toolkit there, teaching assistants as a very vague heading there came out as looking quite expensive as a spend, fairly limited evidence base in terms of the number of padlocks there, very blurred, very old slide this, but a plus one additional month progress for the learners in our care, if you like. So this rating system is used for all these different approaches, all these different spends across a school setting, and at that point, one could say a fairly kind of positive-ish message around the presence, the impact, the influence of teaching assistants on children's learning and their progress. Actually, what I don't have a graphic for is in the interim between then and now, we had some slightly less positive headlines, shall we say. We had some Daily Mail headlines chucked in the mix about, you know, the waste of money and the massive ineffective element of the workforce. Absolute nonsense in many cases, but we know that there were some challenges around the messaging about the impact and the effectiveness of the teaching assistant workforce. More recently, I'll admit this is a slide we shared back sort of in the late teens, when we looked at we mapped the different strands from the toolkit there onto a very simple graph here, and looked at things which are approaches which are promising, maybe worth it, and possibly not worth it. And clearly, you've probably picked up that you know, at high cost and potentially low effect size, low impact, teaching assistants are in that not worth it bracket. And I think again that's really uncomfortable reading at that point. So we just need to consider the legacy context, I suppose, as we go forwards. What I'm pleased to report now is that the more recent evidence that's been generated, the evaluations that have been carried out, and the subtle change here, if you see in the centre of this graphic, rather than just teaching assistants, we're talking specifically around the interventions that teaching assistants can run, where they are well trained, well prepared. We'll hear more about that later on. We can see a really positive impact here in 4 additional months progress. So that is a section on the EF's Teaching and Learning Toolkit. You can click on that headline. You can read a lot more in that, from that particular resource. As you can see, there is a significant cost. The evidence strength is moderate, but I mean, moderate's not bad in the grand scheme of things. And yeah, on average, children may see an additional 4 months progress in one academic year where things go really well. And that's clearly what we are after. It's what we're advocating, and that's what we're going to consider as we go forwards this afternoon. So over to Sally then to dive a little bit more into that evidence base, which I mentioned, about what's been done. Over to you, Sally.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so just to unpick that in a little bit more detail, I want to do this relatively briefly for you. So if you think about the evidence base, essentially we've got a piece of research, an area which is probably, in terms of education research perspective, one of the sort of most researched areas in education, quite frankly. So over the last 20 or so years, huge amounts of research have been done around the impact of support staff on pupil progress. So where we currently are is a slightly mixed picture. I'll just break it down for you. On one hand, what you as a school leader or somebody in a school needs to be aware of is that the research would suggest that when TAs are asked to work with pupils as part of a structured intervention, pupils on the whole, according to research, tend to make progress. So over a period of 18 months, when working with an additional adult as part of a structured intervention, there's a bit of a but about that, which Claire's going to talk about a bit later. Pupils seem to make progress. It feels like a solid deployment model. On the other hand, you'll have lots of TAs who are working outside of an intervention, who are working with pupils more generally across a class. So you happen to be, a table over there or a pupil over there, either with or without an EHCP or additional support, who has a TA working with you for a bit more of the time. The research there would suggest, and this came out of a project called the Deployment and Impact of Support Staff project back in 2012, which has been replicated on smaller projects over the last 10 or so years, found that over a period of 18 months, pupils with more TA support, so those with more adult support, tend not to make as much progress as those children without adult support over a period of 18 months in literacy and numeracy. And in many ways, that throws on its head what we understand about adult support in schools, because it makes sense to you as teachers, as practitioners, as parents, as human beings. If a child is struggling, more support is going to help. And this is saying something different. This is saying that, in fact, that support might not be helping that pupil make progress. And of course, like Tom said, on the back of that came a lot of nasty headlines. Maybe TAs aren't, worth it. Maybe they're not doing a great job. And it really wasn't saying that, but it was saying something very important about how we work with TAs and what we're asking them to do and so on. One point I would say here is, you might say to yourselves, well, of course pupils with TAs are not going to make as much progress. That's obvious, and that's because perhaps they're coming from a different starting point, because in my school they tend to be working with those children that aren't going to make as much progress. But the research controls for all of the things that we know impact on pupil progress, so things like SEM, pupil premium, EAL, all of those things, disadvantage, are controlled for in the research. So as far as possible, you're taking two children from the same starting point. The pupil with more support from TA support outside of an intervention doesn't do as well. So understanding that is very important, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment as to why that might be. Just to give you a bit more evidence, just to sort of bulk this up a little bit, following on from what Claire said in terms of the variety of role, I would also argue that the role has changed considerably over the last 15, 20 or so years, so that long gone are the days when you're asking TAs to wash out a few paint pots and put up a few displays, that increasingly we're asking TAs to take on a more direct instructional teaching role, leading from the front of the class, running interventions, working with pupils with complex needs and so on. And that's where this other evidence base comes in, the MAST and SENT studies, which were longitudinal studies. And what that means is you can track a cohort of pupils over a number of years, build up a really rich picture of what's happening for those children. With this particular study, they were looking at pupils with education, health and care plans, which lots of your TAs will be involved in, looking at pupils from year 5 in primary all the way through to year 9 in secondary, so building up a very rich picture. And what does that research tell us? Well, it talks to us about the experiences of pupils with EHCPs who have TA support. And by taking minute by minute snapshots, thousands of data point entries, what it tells us is that pupils with EHCPs who have high levels of TA support spend far less of their week interacting with their class or subject teacher. About 10% less of the time a week is spent interacting with a class or subject teacher. Almost as a direct result, they're interacting for less of their week with their peers. If they're not interacting with peers or teachers, who are they interacting with? Well, no big surprise, interacting for far more of their week with a TA. And on average, in primary school, about a day a week is spent interacting, according to the research, with a TA TA, not as part of a class or a group or a pair or an intervention, but on a one-to-one basis. So just that one adult and that one pupil interacting together. In primary school, that's about a day a week. As you move into secondary school, similar picture, but it reduces to about 14% of the week. At this point, I'm not making a value judgment about that. I'm not saying is that a good or a bad thing. What we have to recognize then as school leaders and practitioners is the importance of that person in that student's education experience and what's sitting under the research, which is suggesting that maybe they're not having as much impact as they might have on pupil progress. Now, the reasons for that are varied, and we can talk to you towards at the end of this session about if you want further sort of training or support for your school on that. But what I would be saying to you in this sort of short session today is this is not about TAs doing anything wrong. It's not actually about school leaders doing anything wrong or teachers doing anything wrong either. It's what happens in schools. As we work through the recommendations, we'll pick out why TAs maybe aren't having as much impact. But one of the key reasons, which Claire's going to talk about in depth, but which I just really want to stress for you, which underpins, in my mind, all of this work here, is the idea that in most settings, TAs overwhelmingly work with pupils who are either lower attaining or have SEND in some way. And what that does is create a separation effect for those pupils, a separation effect which the Marston SEND study refer to, a separation effect between themselves and their peers and themselves and their class or subject teachers. It's that separation effect which ultimately negatively impacts the impact that TAs can have on pupil progress. So that's the thing I would say for you is probably the most important to consider. Just before I move on to Claire next, just to say, for me, and I've been working in this now for about 10 years or something, a good piece of news for you all is that getting this right, in my mind, is not about the number of TAs that you have. I work in schools or support schools that have got huge numbers of TAs. I work in schools that have got, 2 or 3. It's not about how many you have, although most staff in most schools will say, we don't have enough support here. I don't think it's about how many you have supporting pupils. I think it's how you're using and working and understanding the deployment of this really important staff workforce. In terms of responding to that research evidence, what do you do about it? Well, like Tom referred to, the EEF is a great guide here. So what they do is they synthesize the research that's out there on lots of different topics. They've done lots of work with us around the TA research, and they produce these guidance reports. You'll be very familiar with this one because the EEF TA guidance report was the first one that was published back in 2015. It was the first of its kind. There's been lots since on lots of different subject areas. It's been published 3 times since. This is the most latest updated edition. It has 5 recommendations, and we're going to walk you through quite briefly each of these recommendations along with some sort of key takeaways. So I suppose in my mind, this document for you is a sort of synthesis of the research and what you might be trying to work towards. Alongside that, we have the EEF SEN guidance, which came later, but I would say is a very useful document to go hand in hand with it. It offers specific guidance around special educational needs in mainstream schools, but recommendation 5 in particular specifically talks to this point about how we utilise and work with TAs. So you don't want to reinvent the wheel when you're working in schools. You don't want to be doing more than one thing. If you're doing some work around SEND provision already, that fits neatly into what you might be doing around TA deployment as well. I don't think we've got a copy on our slides, but the other one I would just refer you to if you are doing some work around here is the EF guidance around implementation, because increasingly with this work, what I recognise is there is no quick fix to it. Using the implementation guidance and how you affect significant and sustainable change in your setting, it's a really useful guidance to go alongside with these two. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sally. That's excellent sort of scene setting. So with that in mind, we're now going to push on and work our way through those 5 recommendations. I think Claire is going to start us off by looking at recommendation 1.
Thanks. Yes. So we're going to look at deploying TAs in ways that enable all pupils to access high quality teaching. So we're definitely thinking about in this recommendation the amount of time that particular pupils might spend with particular members of staff. So if you wouldn't mind, try and hold a pupil in mind, maybe with complex needs, may have an EHCP, maybe waiting for an EHCP, may have newly arrived. And, you know, think about if you've tracked them through the day, who do they spend the most time with? Is that their peers? Who do they get the most direct instruction from? Is it the teacher? Because actually what we would hope is that the child with the most barriers, the greatest challenges, the most complex needs receives most direct instruction and explicit teaching from the expert in the room. And that's not to devalue the expertise and experience that teaching assistants bring into the classroom, but for the most part the teacher is the most qualified in the room and should be thinking about delivering that high quality teaching to all of those pupils for as much of the time as is possible and exposing them to that. So any work that TAs do then with pupils should supplement that and not replace it. So you're thinking about rising tide lifting all ships, so that if we can start from a place of really high quality teaching, then maybe adaptation for particular pupils and then intervention just supports that. But you have to start from that quality first approach. But yeah, definitely thinking about how the relationships between those teachers and TAs meet all those people needs. Often in schools, I hear from teachers, TAs, children, parents who talk about my TA and a TA being allocated to a particular child. And so thinking about that child in mind, if they are spending an inordinate amount of time with a teaching assistant, they are not getting access to their peer group and to that high quality instruction, but also they then become stuck. So you can see the images on the screen. So we've got some Velcro and an elastic band. So it's a really good analogy to think about this, because you want your teaching assistants to be that elastic band with a pupil, to, you know, thinking about it's encouraging the TA to use and provide scaffolding. So you're stretching the child's independence. So you want to be pulling out to observe from afar, and then snapping back in only when the support is really needed, and to intervene. In my experience, colleagues in practitioners in early years do this really well, and it's balanced alongside those quality interactions, but we need to be replicating that through all of our phases. Whereas if you take the Velcro as that example, the TA is then stuck to that pupil, and that child might refer to that TA as my TA. The parents may do that the same. And not only are they stuck physically, they then become stuck emotionally to that single pupil all day. And then you have difficulties then in building transition, and that learned helplessness. Because we're not giving those pupils the opportunity to develop that confidence or independence. And as Sally said, you know, research suggests that then isolates and restricts them from their peers and actually reduces their teaching time. So it's an unintended consequence where we're trying to do the best for a pupil by providing additional teaching assistant time and support. And what actually happens is that separation effect. And the other thing that happens is that both the pupil and the TA can become really focused on task completion, like getting something done as a sign of success and achievement, which might be working through a worksheet or a page on a workbook or doing some activity, and then it's not focused on the learning. So yeah, just always thinking about how you are balancing that and really thinking about the amount of time that those pupils spend with the expert in the room. We've got quite far without mentioning Ofsted, but, you know, I am a school leader by heart. And so, you know, that there is that elephant in the room. The new case sampling approach from the toolkit really helps this. If you choose a child and look at them and the time that they spend, the diet that they have, it's really interesting activity to do, which might be something that you think about. So the key takeaway here is really thinking about that universal provision. So the high quality teaching for all pupils, And the other thing just to mention, again, we haven't got a slide on this because it's all new and coming, is that just thinking about the SEND reforms that are due. So primary and secondary schools are going to be required to have their inclusion strategy published by the 31st of December. So this is how schools demonstrate their approach to delivering high quality provision for pupils with SEN, and demonstrate how the notional SEN budget is allocated. So it's a good opportunity to think about that. Think about what is the high quality ordinary available provision, what is that offer for those children, and does it meet those children's needs and fulfills the conditions of the grant, or is it very much their allocation is a teaching assistant for the majority of the time, and that may or may not be targeted intervention. Again, it may be this Velcro approach. So yeah, another point to consider that's kind of coming up on the horizon. I think I'm probably done on that one, unless anything else to add. Sally, do you want to, if I've missed anything there?
I muted myself, Claire. That's a rookie error. Yes, I was just going to add that just a helpful question maybe for colleagues is particularly around this, when you're thinking about universal provision and you're thinking about pupils across the school, and easier for those children that don't have really high levels of support, and it's more complicated when you're thinking about, but this child does have very high levels, complex needs, they do spend a lot of time with their TA, they need to spend, then I would be saying to you to consider, the question for you as school leaders, as practitioners, is how in our school do we ensure that our teachers retain responsibility and accountability for all pupils in their class? How do we do that? Because it's not just physical time spent with all pupils, there's other things too. So there's questions around who's first point of contact with parents, for instance, who does the planning and adaptation for pupils, who's updating objectives, who's looking at paperwork. It's some of those questions. And as I've said, Claire's going to come on to this when she looks at intervention. But for instance, who knows about what's going on outside of the class? You might well have a pupil who has high levels of support from an additional adult. It doesn't mean that you can't attack this separation effect. It doesn't mean that you can't ensure that you are still retaining responsibility and accountability for all pupils in your class, even if you're not working with them for, huge amounts of the day. If that's helpful. It might not be. Recommendation 2. So if we're thinking about the research base, why is it that perhaps TAs don't have as much impact as we think? Well, we've just spoken about this idea that TAs overwhelmingly work with particular children. That leads to a separation effect. Area number 2 is that research suggests that overwhelmingly TAs, more than anyone else, tend to prioritise task completion and jump in too quickly with children's work. When they do that, it leads to what we call a learned helplessness. It negatively impacts progress over time. So, recommendation 2 is all about attacking that. It's trying to say to us, look, we don't want TAs to do that. We know it can impact progress. So rather than jumping in and over supporting, we want to deploy TAs which enable them to scaffold pupils' learning. And Claire was talking about some of these things with regards to the elastic band. Before I talk to you about that, I think it's really helpful just to consider, if that's the case in my school, if TAs might jump in a bit quickly, why might that be? Because we can teach them to scaffold, we definitely can, but we first of all need to understand why they jump in a bit quickly. Now, I've worked with probably tens of thousands of TAs on this, and I can, because we haven't got much time, I'd normally go to you, but I will just tell you most of the reasons I hear are, number 1, I think it reflects badly on me if there's nothing down on the paper, if I haven't finished something. Number 2, I think that I want the child I'm working with to do well. It comes from a place of kindness. Or the pace of the lesson. I have to jump in a bit too quickly because the pace of the lesson is so quick that if I don't jump in, we're going to get behind. Or the work isn't adapted right. I have to jump in too quickly because the work is too difficult. There are other reasons too, but I'd say those are some of the main ones. Understanding contextually why your TA is jumping quickly is as important as understanding how they then scaffold. Because if it's that TAs do it because they think they're going to be in trouble if there's nothing on the paper, then you need to address that first of all, I would be arguing. So that's your first point. Once you've understood that, you then want to move towards, right, we're going to try and scaffold learning. Now, essentially, if there was nothing else you remembered from me today, the one thing I would be asking you to take away would be that this means to offer the least amount of help first. Okay, so we're going in with that assumption, least amount of help first. And I don't think TAs always work with pupils on that assumption. Next, you want to define what you mean by scaffolding. Now, we use the term scaffolding, all over the place in schools. Everyone knows what it means. But actually, if you were to ask everyone in your school what they meant by scaffolding, I think they would have different definitions of that term. So understanding that comes next. When I'm talking about it, I'm talking about a three-stage process. I'm talking about the pupil being able to do the part of the task that they can do themselves. The TA stepping in just for the bit that the pupil can't do. So there's an assumption they do the thing they can do by themselves. Of course, if a TA was then to say, well, there's nothing they can do of this activity, I would be suggesting it's the wrong activity. So they then step in with support for the bit the pupil can't do. And stage 3 is the pupil should then have an opportunity to do the bit they couldn't do as part of the whole because of that consolidation that's necessary. So when I talk about scaffolding and pupil independence, sometimes we talk about stepping back. We have to make pupils independent by stepping back. And I'm not sure it is that. I think that really good scaffolding is knowing when to step in. Knowing when to step in by recognising the bit that the pupil can already do, so I hold back, and the bit that the pupil can't do, so now I step in. The scaffolding framework that goes alongside this work, which we don't have time to go into in at all today, really, not even just in any depth, but really at all, is really helpful tool to guide you with what to step in with. Because if we're sure that when we're scaffolding, this is the point at which the student needs some support, we can still over support. I could still step in with too much. And the scaffolding framework that you see on this slide, the triangle, supports TAs and teachers knowing what to step in with. All you need to know at this point is that it's based on the assumption that whatever you're doing has already been modelled once. The other things to know are that the further up the framework you are, the lower levels of support from the additional adult, the higher levels of independence. By the time you move right to the bottom of part of that triangle, which is correcting, we have very high levels of adult support, very low levels of pupil independence. So we're trying to keep our interactions as far as possible to the top half of that framework. The only other thing to know is that self-scaffolding is different to the others, because self-scaffolding is the thing that the pupil is doing, the other 4 are the thing that the adult is doing. And we don't have time to go into self-scaffolding now, but when we're talking about that, essentially we're talking about the metacognitive skills of planning, problem solving and reviewing. In terms of key takeaway, I would be suggesting that what you need to do before any of this is do what I started off by saying, and that's to consider the contextual issues that either support or hinder TAs being able to scaffold in the classroom. To ask your staff, audit them, chat to them about this work. Do you think you might jump in a bit quickly? Why might that happen? Most people would admit that they can be guilty of that. I've been teaching a long time. I definitely do it. I think we all do it with our own children if you have, children. Ask them why it is. Is it pace of lesson? Is it lack of time? Is it the activity? Is it that they think that's what they should be doing? Sometimes there's an easier fix to this than you might at first anticipate. Thanks, Tom. How are we doing time-wise, by the way? Are we on track?
We're absolutely spot on. Thank you, Sally. Great. But over to Claire now then to look at recommendation 3.
Thanks. I'll try not to derail our effective timing so far. So recommendation 3 is around deploying TAs to deliver well-chosen evidence-based structured interventions where appropriate, which is the key part to this recommendation. And earlier on, Tom talked about looking at the impact of teaching assistants, and where there were well-chosen evidence-based structured interventions, that's where we see more progress for pupils. So it's really important that we dive into this one and think about what do we mean by that evidence-based intervention. So they do need to be carefully considered, monitored and linked to the classroom to ensure positive outcomes for pupils. So linking back to the first recommendation about that high quality teaching, again, these interventions should support what is happening in the classroom. I also find it helpful to call it an outvention, not an intervention, because if they're in an intervention, they are out of the classroom. So they are automatically away from that quality first teaching. So as a teacher who is responsible for all of those children in their class, and every teacher, every adult is a teacher of SEND, we've got to be assured that what is happening outside of the classroom is of high enough quality that it is better for the pupil than receiving that quality first teaching. So it's also thinking about critically evaluating the impact data of an intervention. I liken it a little bit to when you go into the supermarket. If you've got buy anything that's like kind of health related, they'll put on, you know, it's got 25% of this, or it's got increased protein and it's great for you. And all of those adverts, it's normally really highly processed, and it might advertise loads of, low calorie, but actually be high in something else. You don't see that advert on fruit and vegetables. Like, everybody knows they're really good for you. They don't need that advert. Interventions a little bit like that. The shinier and the bigger the claim on a bought-in package, often when you look at it, implementation might be very limited to particular conditions, or it's a very narrow evidence base. So again, really critically looking at the data that comes from those interventions, because what you want is for the progress that happens within that intervention to be transferable back into the classroom. And often when I go into support schools to review interventions, and I ask why you're doing intervention, there are a plethora of reasons why people do an intervention. Sometimes it's down to the financial investment. So one of my schools I picked up, they'd invested in, it might have been Powerphonics, I don't know, some sort of program, and it was really expensive, lots of training, lots of time and lots of resources. So they were still delivering it because there'd been this investment, and felt that we couldn't stop it because of that waste of money, but it wasn't well suited to the wider phonics scheme that was happening, so it wasn't effective. Sometimes it's because TAs have always been doing that intervention. It might be well liked by pupils, engagement might be high, enjoyment might be high, but it's really thinking about that impact. And it's often harder to move away from something when you're invested in it. So if you've got any of those IKEA cubes, I'm looking behind me because I have some here. When I put those together, I'm more invested in them because I put them together. I might cling on to them in case I need them. It's worth looking at your interventions in the same way. And then thinking about where are the gaps. If the data in your settings suggests that you've got a higher SEMH need for pupils in year 3, are the interventions matched to that, or are they around cognition and learning? And thinking about that universal and targeted provision, thinking about where the significance is that according to your data. And as teachers in that classroom, it's about that monitoring to be sure of the benefit. So it's really difficult, isn't it, as a class teacher, to have oversight of what's happening outside when you are delivering that quality first teaching. But there needs to be a monitoring schedule to look at, attendance of the intervention, impact, transferable skill back into the classroom, to make sure that our good intentions and our well-planned interventions are reviewed really critically and changes made if needs be. But also thinking about what you might stop to allow space for something else. Often we're guilty of adding more and more onto plates for children, more interventions because this isn't working, rather than actually pausing something for a period of time, making the main thing, and maybe just distilling exactly what it is that pupil needs and focusing on that at the time. So the key takeaway from this is about auditing that intervention offer in your school, in your setting, across the trust, thinking about time out of class, how much delivery, when are those assessment points, often you can do an entry in and entry out, and all that's showing is the children have got better at doing the intervention. They haven't then applied that back in the classroom. So making sure I'm really looking at it critically. And that's not to say that just because an intervention wasn't successful, it's not always a TA not working hard enough or the child not working hard enough. It's just looking at that really critically. So yeah, teachers need to be assured about that consolidation, and any activity outside of their classroom is still ultimately their responsibility.
Well, thank you, Claire. I think I can't help but add one little extra here. I think it's Mark Rowland, isn't it, Sally? The hotels principle. When you're thinking about your interventions, it's a bit like going away for the weekend and staying in a hotel. If the hotel's not any nicer than your house, then what's the point? So, whenever an intervention is taking place, a child or a group is removed from the mainstream education offer, their peers, their teacher, it's got to be absolute dynamite, hasn't it? Because that trade-off's taking place. Let's make sure it's worth it. Okay, so we're over to Sally now to consider recommendation 4.
Thank you. So recommendation 4 is all about preparation. So what sits under the evidence in terms of lack of impact can also be around lack of preparation. So I mentioned before, I would argue that the role of TAs has changed considerably over the last 10 or 15 years. So I think it's worth questioning whether we have kept up in terms of preparing and training staff for their role and what effective deployment looks like. And I would say that we maybe haven't, not just TAs, but teachers too. I think that sometimes there can be ambiguity across teacher teams around how teachers and TAs could and should work together, particularly if you're in a secondary setting and you maybe only have a TA, coming into your room, 3 times a week who you don't know very well. It can be quite difficult to know how to best deploy that person. Equally, I would argue that TAs are in a position of often having to go in blind to lessons. And I think that TAs on the whole are very good at this. I think they're very good at going in blind to lessons and cracking on with whatever it is they have to do. But actually, what I get to see, because I get to review a lot of schools and just scratch the surface a little bit, is that often through no fault of their own, TAs don't actually know what they perhaps should be doing, or at least they're working on the activity, but maybe not the objective. So I walk into a lesson, I can see what the activity is. I'll sit down with this group of children. Yep, I'll do it. I'll crack on with it. That's great. But actually, if I'm not really clear about what the objective is, or I've gone in slightly blind, I'm having to slightly make it up or adapt it on the hoof, maybe there's going to be an impact on progress. So around prep, it's something that scares schools because there quite frankly isn't a lovely half a day PPA sitting around for teachers and TAs to be meeting and working through what needs to be done. And so there feels like a bit of a potential, budget and time capacity issue here. The first thing I would be saying to you is consider in what ways might a TA be underprepared? Because I think there's different ways. So I might be underprepared in terms of the lesson objective. I don't really know what this lesson's about. I know we're doing, adding two-digit numbers together, but I don't really know for this pupil what that specifically is about, right? So am I prepared in terms of lesson or lesson objective? Am I prepared in terms of, if I'm running an intervention, having the right resources to hand, having the right things that I need? Am I prepared in terms of my skills and training? Like Claire talked about, staff at her own setting, actually maybe I'm coming into the school and, I'm not really confident on year 6 maths, for instance. Maybe I've been asked to work with a boy with ASD and actually I've had no experience of complex need before. So actually, is there some gaps in my own skills and training? Can I be underprepared in that way? Am I underprepared in terms of knowing the pupil I'm working with? I've just been told to go in that class and I've got to work with, William over there. And actually, I don't really know his need. I haven't had an opportunity to look at his EHCP. I cannot tell you the number of schools I go into where I see TAs working with pupils, sometimes over a prolonged period of time. And I ask about the EHCP and they say, oh, I don't know. I don't know if he's got one or not, and indeed he definitely has. They just haven't been given it. That's an aside. So there's different ways in which we can be underprepared. Or I go into a class and I just don't know what the teacher wants from me. I don't normally work with this teacher. I feel a bit of a spare part. I'm going to just sort of sit at the back and sit next to a child and talk to that child, and repeat everything that the teacher is saying because I think that's what I should be doing in that sort of echo effect. It's not necessarily a good use of my time. So consider in which way the TA might be underprepared. And then you're going to have to address that in different ways. If it's that I don't know what you want from me in this lesson, well, we talk all the time about teacher TA partnerships. Maybe you need to do a piece of work across the whole school around what good deployment looks like. We talk about, finding some clarity on what differentiated but coordinated roles might look like. If I'm doing this as part of an input as the teacher, it would be really helpful if you could do this. Or during my plenary, it would be really helpful if you could do that. So maybe getting some clarity across your school. What is the expectation of the role? That might be helpful. Thinking about planning itself. If it's I'm underprepared in terms of the lesson or the activity, how is planning shared? What is shared? Sometimes schools say to me, well, the planning's on the server, or we email it to staff beforehand, and I look on the server and I realise that unless you did that planning, no one in the world would understand what that lesson was about. Or it's emailed to TAs on a Friday night. Well, should they have to look at it on a Friday night? Perhaps not. Or it's on the server, but the TA can't access the server. How's planning shared, and what planning is shared? If I pick up that planning, can I glean from it what I'm supposed to be doing? Pupil understanding and knowledge. Is the right documentation shared with staff? And then think about auditing staff in terms of gaps around skills or knowledge. It's a real problem for senior leaders not being able to deploy people in particular areas because maybe they don't have the skill or the experience. So consider maybe carrying out a bit of an audit at the start of a new academic year. What skills and experience do staff have? Where do they think they have particular strengths? Where are the particular weaknesses, perhaps? I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. Am I all right, Tom?
We're almost there.
Okay, because I've got one. Okay, I'll say one more thing then. So, for me, I would be asking not just what to do about TAs being underprepared, but first of all, consider in what ways are TAs underprepared, if indeed they are, because the steps you will take will be different depending on the answer to that question, in my mind.
I think I just add before I hand over to Claire for the final recommendation. I think in a secondary context where I am, it's especially important that partnerships business. This document here you can see is one that's available from the EF now. I actually quite like the old one, Sally, which talks
I
about
preferred it.
really practical at the beginning of a lesson, during teacher input, during independent work, during plenary. There's some agreements you can come across, and I think no matter what the context of the scenario, at least both adults or 3, 4 adults in the room have a pre-agreed sense of where they're going and what they're going to do. So yeah, really challenging this one, but particularly in a secondary setting. Okay, over to Claire then for final recommendation 5. Over to
Thanks, Tom. And Sally mentioned earlier about the implementation guidance, and it comes through strongly in this recommendation. So yeah, just another kind of signpost to that document, which is really useful. So the final recommendation is about engaging all staff in the process of implementing effective TA deployment. So it can't be something that is done in isolation. And often you might have, a senior leader that has suddenly been tasked with TA line management, for example, because the Senko hasn't got the time to do that because they're also part-time, and it can't work in silo from some of the other competing priorities that often happen in schools. So it's again about making sure that TA deployment is informed by the underpinning evidence and the challenges of putting it into practice. So very much thinking about what are the conditions for implementation, when is the right time to be reviewing this and auditing this. We've talked about reviewing your interventions, thinking about the amount of time that pupils might spend with particular adults, doing some of that review before you enter into making changes to practice is a really important part of that. But thinking about when is the right time to do that in an academic year, and engaging, aligning the school community to build a shared understanding of good TA practice. So that shared language of what does scaffolding look like to us. Sally mentioned that earlier, but often when I go into schools and say, talk to me about what scaffolding looks like, everybody has a slightly different meaning. So really making sure that that's clear. and also about communicating that to parents, carers, families, particularly if you're starting to move away from that Velcro model, which has been, unintended, but is in a particular way. Think about how it's going to impact all of those stakeholders, but being really deliberate about deployment decisions, but in the context of those other priorities. So in terms of advice, I guess it's thinking about, where is TA deployment on the school development plan? If you've got an area or an improvement plan, whatever term you use, if you're looking at improving inclusion, it should sit within that, not as something separate. What about your pupil premium strategy? And sometimes it's easier in schools where you have higher numbers of children who are eligible for free school meals, because you can adopt more whole school approaches. But your pupil premium strategy shouldn't sit over here. Your TA deployment sit here, and then your inclusion strategy sit here, because everything should be moving in the same direction and not be competing. Often for staff time, attention, training, and we talked about the challenges of that right at the beginning, but also about monitoring of that. If you're going to make changes, it's about planning in the monitoring of that, because you need to engage people around the why for change. And some of that helpful evidence base is really useful, I think, for school leaders, but uniting school staff and community around that common purpose and reflecting on where there are areas of good practice and where there is room for that improvement. But yeah, really thinking about your universal provision and back to that quality first teaching should be well supported by those well chosen interventions that are evidence based and not be competing. So yeah, again, just another push for the implementation guidance, thinking about exploring the current reality in your schools, and then thinking about spending some real time about preparing for that change. And when you've delivered that change, thinking about how is that able to be sustained, and where is that monitoring schedule within that? Otherwise, it will become something that is launched in September and then really not revisited throughout that time. So the key takeaway is the alignment with other school priorities. So if you're somebody around the screen that isn't the decision maker in your school or setting or trust, it can't sit in isolation. This can't be a separate project. It needs to be, combined with lots of those other document strategies, plans that we've talked about, and thinking about that timetable. And again, just another push, I suppose, on if we're making a change here, what else can we stop to make the space, time and room for change, and thinking about some of those change models about how you might implement that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. So that is your whistle-stop tour of the 5 recommendations from the EF's guidance report. There is the summary recommendations poster. That, alongside the full guidance report itself, is downloadable from the EF website for free as a PDF. But at this point, I'll remind colleagues, certainly in the English system, I know we've got a couple of international colleagues here, if you want hard copies of any of these documents, for you or for colleagues, then you get in touch with your local research school. You actually can't get them direct from the EF. So you contact your local research school and you put in your request that way. For me, looking back at the key takeaways, I suppose, recommendation 1 is about supplement, not replace. Recommendation 2 is about least help first. Recommendation 3 is around those interventions and auditing what's going on, and remembering that hotels principle. Recommendation 4, I would say, is about preparedness, and particularly about partnerships and working out those coordinated roles. And then 5, as we've just seen there, is about alignment with other school priorities and taking a structured but flexible approach and in stages to implementing change in this very tricky area. So that guidance is available, as I say, for you to download. I thought I also would just flag that alongside the full guidance document and that recommendations poster, there is a load of additional resource available from the EF website as well, and you'll see them on the right there in terms of a list. All PDFs, all useful in terms of this work. Again, all freely available to download for you and for your school. And we'll just finish off then by saying that if this session this afternoon has sort of piqued your interest, this whistle-stop tour through the guidance, and has made you think we could do with some more, there's a couple of offers here. First of all, from us at the Research School, for a good number of years, we have recruited Sally to come to our part of the West Country and to deliver a 3-day programme which really dives really deeply into this guidance we've talked about this afternoon. And actually, what Sally's brilliant at is supporting you to go through that implementation process and actually write an implementation plan. You leave the third day with a plan to move forwards, on the area which is most relevant and pertinent to you. So that, as you can see there, is about senior leaders, Senkos and teaching leads and so on, thinking about deployment models in their schools, and you'll see the cost of that. If that's something that's of interest, then I'd like you to get in touch with us through our website or through the chat now, or hang on in a moment and let me know about that. Clearly, when we put those types of programs on, we're interested in groups of schools, whether that's community learning partnerships, whether that's dioceses, whether that's local authorities, whether that's head teacher associations, whether that's trusts, MATs, etc. But either way, that is available as an offer. Once we've done that, well, oftentimes once we've done that, Sally is then roped in to do some further sort of follow-up training and support. Sally, do you want to share what you offer then following those programs?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So the first thing to say is I think there's two strands to this work, and I know that we're about out of time, but on one hand, we've been talking today about strategic deployment of TAs. So what you as school leaders need to be thinking about when you're thinking about how to use TAs. But of course, there's something also around TA training and teacher training around scaffolding and interactions. So there's sort of two strands to this work. I support with all of those things. So I do lots of work with schools both here in the UK and internationally. I do school reviews, so I'll go along and do some sort of bespoke work with the school where we look through the deployment strategy and we'll look through the school improvement plan and do lots of work around that. And normally I'll do some work with teachers and TAs as well, training them around scaffolding, maybe doing some work with parents too, looking at classroom practice, looking at changes in the way that deployment might work. We also have webinars, so if you can't have live face-to-face visits or training, we have access to some webinars that may well be helpful for you, so you can contact me about those things. The thing about this is there can be sensitivities around this work. Claire talked about uniting staff, and I think that's really important in all implementation. With this area in particular, there can be sensitivities because you're talking about different priorities from different people, parents, TAs, teachers, senior leaders. People can be thinking about this in different ways. So it can be quite helpful to sort of have an outsider, I think, come in and support you with some of this work because it's then not feeling like you're having to lead the whole thing yourself. So if you're interested in any of those things, the webinars or any face-to-face support, then you can just contact me via Tom, or I can give you my email address shortly.
I was just going to say, Sally, perhaps in the chat you could drop in your website and your email contact details so that people can go to you direct. But as Sally said, you can also come through us as well. What we will do then is to follow up this session with an email with links to resources and to people, and you can clearly keep that conversation going as we go forwards. So, we won't take questions now, sort of in the chat, but I'm suggesting that we'll stay on if we need to. If there's anybody who would like to ask a question afterwards, and as I say, respond to the follow-up email which comes next, probably before the end of this week. I'll finish just by saying that we are one of the 33 research schools in the network. Particularly if you're nearby, join our network, our Somerset Research School network. There is no fee, there's no memberships, no secret club. It's just about staying informed. So you can receive our newsletter, which keeps you posted on the new evidence that's coming out, new resources, the training, the offers, the blogs, the podcasts, etc., that are available for you. And my contact details are on there, but please do follow us if you use those socials. Thank you for this afternoon. I hope you found it useful. Feel free to make a comment in the chat if you wish now. But we'll end the recording there, and please do stay in touch. Thank you very much.